I've had a few jobs over the years, but this is the very first time I've ever stood on a stage under the heading Truly Criminal. so let's see how we go. Let's get stuck straight into it. Let's step into that dark world of greed and brutality, where the powerful treat their victims with sheer contempt. That evil underbelly of society, driven only by power and profit. That unforgiving underworld, where the vicious and uncaring plunder, pillage, loot and steal from their innocent victims. But enough about the publishing industry. Our guest here today is Dan Box, and he has a very, very impressive CV. Dan's a Walkley Award winner. I think he's won 3 Walkley Awards, the Supreme Prize in Australian journalism. He's a best-selling author. He's previously worked for The Australian, the BBC and London's The Sunday Times. He's won awards both in the UK and here, including for a lot of his investigative reporting work. He's one of the best investigative reporters in this country and in the UK. So welcome, Dan Box. Now, Dan's actually going to talk about something here that you rarely hear when it comes to the subject of crime, and it's on the importance of being honest. When he began writing the story of Zak Grieve, a young Aboriginal man given a life sentence for his role in a murder in the Northern Territory, and there was, despite evidence that he actually played no real role in the actual killing, Dan began to harbour some doubts about his own motives for doing the book. And it led to a lot of soul searching. It's quite a fascinating part of this book that I want him to talk about. But before we get to that, Dan, why don't you first give us a quick overview of what the book's about and how you became involved with Zak's case?
Okay, and thank you for the opportunity to be up here today. It's always a pleasure to be up on the Central Coast. Just driving in on those roads this morning with the glimpses of the water, getting out of the car, and there's just a nice feeling in the air up here. This
is why we don't like outsiders coming in, actually.
And I appreciate you giving me your time for the morning that I'm allowed to be here before you send me back down south. Look, honest answer is, if we're going to talk honestly, I got into doing this for all the wrong reasons. I got into reporting on Zak and what he did or didn't do because I wanted to win another award. And look, we laugh, but it's actually not funny because it's absolutely the wrong reason to do this. So the backstory is I was doing another project about a different case, a triple murder, and that went really well. Won a couple of awards for that. And then people were coming up to me and saying, "Oh, what are you going to do next? What's the next big project?" And I just wanted to win another big award. I was young, I was stupid, I was not young enough to excuse it. Garry and I were talking about this a bit earlier. I just wanted the validation. And so somebody came up to me and said, "Have you heard about this case?" And gave me a copy of a Good Weekend magazine article. And I looked at it, and it was about this young lad, Zak Grieve, who had been jailed for life in the Northern Territory. And life in the Northern Territory actually means life. You will not get out of prison. Minimum 20-year non-parole period before we will even consider whether you might get parole, and that's not guaranteed.
It's quite different, isn't it? Because they have mandatory sentencing.
It's mandatory sentencing, and that is one of the issues. I mean, look, we could talk about the Northern Territory justice system for far longer than I'm going to be here today. But one of the problems is mandatory sentencing, where the politicians tell the judges what sentences to impose. So the judges aren't allowed to take into account the fact that this person may have come from a brutally awful family, may have had a horrendous life, may have not really understood what they were doing, or in Zak's case, not actually physically been there when the murder was committed. They had to send him down for life, meaning life, minimum 20 years. And so there was all this in this Good Weekend article, and I looked at it and I thought, man, that's bad, isn't it? And there was a line from the judge in the sentencing where the judge said, "I take no pleasure in this outcome. It's the fault of the mandatory sentencing laws which inevitably bring about injustice." So the judge who sent Zak to jail was saying, the laws are unjust and what's happening here is wrong. And I looked at that line from the judge and I thought, that's so very wrong that if I do some reporting on it, I might win another Walkley. And we laugh, but that's terrible. I'm not the only journalist to think like that. And since I've said it publicly, other journalists have come up and said, look, actually, yeah, we do the same thing. But I went into doing this reporting not because I cared about Zak, not because I cared about what happened to him, not because I even, at that point, had even met his family. I did it because I thought there's some big issues here that I can get stuck into, and that will reflect well on me. All of that has changed over the years since, and I regret it and I'm embarrassed about it, and it is kind of funny to look back on. But I got into this for all the wrong reasons.
All right, well, just tell us a little bit about Zak himself, because the book says he grew up at the crossroads between right and wrong, white and black, punishment and forgiving.
Yeah.
So what was his life like growing up?
Well, Zak grew up in Katherine in the Northern Territory, which if any of you have not been, I'd encourage you to go. It's a great little town. Best coffee I've ever had was, and everybody laughs about that. It's true, I'm not joking. Best coffee sold out of a converted shipping container in Katherine. Katherine is on the highway going north-south and the highway going east-west through the desert. So it's literally at the crossroads in the middle of just a whole lot of red dirt and heat and hard living. And it's the kind of town where you grow up and you're either, to be really honest, you're either white and things are probably going to be okay, or you're Aboriginal and life's going to be a lot tougher. You might be living in the encampment down by the river. You're probably going to get ignored by all the white people who live in town. Your outcome, you're going to have a shorter life, a harder life. And Zak himself, he's got a white dad and an Aboriginal mum. So he's at these two crossroads between these two worlds, and you grow up there, and it's not just unforgiving, it's pretty unpromising. Like, I don't really know how you get out of Katherine, not easily. Education wasn't great, prospects weren't great, home life had its challenges, and Zak's talked about that. There was a lot of domestic violence he saw in his family, his extended family, and to be honest, he tried to escape. He played a lot of video games, a lot. He smoked a lot of dope. He watched a lot of anime. He read comic books. He started to create this alternative life in his head, I think, without consciously doing it. Because I think that world was easier to escape into, maybe, than the world that he was actually born into and was going to grow up into and then was going to have to become an adult in. And he was also right at that crossroads between being a child and an adult. He was about 18, 19 when the murder happened. And then he was put in prison. And he became an adult in prison. And I actually spoke to him most recently on Sunday. We caught up on the phone. And he's doing well now. But that imaginary world I spoke about, I think that sustained him in prison. And I know I've gone off the topic now. Zak became a writer. And he's not bad. His poetry has gone from being absolutely god-awful years ago to this poetry he writes now. I read it and I'm like, that's actually bloody good. And he writes fiction. And in his cell, for a long time in a Northern Territory prison, he would create these imagined worlds. And he would write them down. He wrote entire novels by hand in prison, stacked up on sheets of paper like that. And he'd carry them between cells when he was moved. And I've said to him, and he says, he agrees, that the only thing that got him going through prison, and not everyone survives that prison, is being able to escape into those imagined worlds. And that fascinated me. Yeah.
I mean, to me, I've just finished reading the book, and I'd urge as many of you as possible to have a read of it, because it's not your average true crime book.
No.
Like you can go, and there's a lot of true crime books out there at the moment, and you can flick through them, and a lot of them are written very quickly. There's a very interesting story behind this, but to me, one of the great features of this book, the writing is terrific. It's almost novelistic, but you also use a lot of the correspondence that you set up with Zak. And Zak is not an accomplished writer. Like, grammar-wise,
No.
punctuation-wise, spelling-wise.
No. He's got his own system.
But he's got his own systems, as you say, and I found myself drawn to it more and more. I just wanted to keep reading more and more of his correspondence with you. I mean, how long were you corresponding with him for, and how did that come about?
Oh, years. I've got stacks of letters from Zak. The letters with Zak come out of... When I originally got into working on Zak, I was a reporter, newspaper reporter, and I got into it for all the wrong reasons. And we did a series, which was a video series and some print reporting in the paper about Zak and about mandatory sentencing. And I put some months of work into that. And as a result, at least partly of that reporting, Zak's sentence was reduced from life imprisonment to minimum 14 years, after which they would release him. It was this strange old, almost medieval power that the Queen has something called the prerogative of mercy, where she can overturn any court's findings in her jurisdiction, which is obviously everywhere we invaded. And they made that exception for Zak, partly because of the reporting we'd done. And I thought I was done then. I thought, that's it. Well done. Got the awards. Great. And then I got a call from Zak's dad. And I can remember where I was. I was walking down the street in inner city Sydney. And he called me up and he said, mate, I've got a message from Zak. And I was like, oh, yeah. Expecting the message to be, thanks so much. You're great. You're a wonderful person and reporter. And I owe you everything. And the message was, grow some balls and defend me. And what had happened was Zak had been in prison and I'd been on TV talking about the case, and Zak had watched it and he'd been completely unimpressed. Because I'd been hedging my bets. I'd been trying to be the objective reporter, standing back, saying, no, I'm not in the fray, I'm above it. And Zak's message was, yeah, grow some balls. But also, by defend me, he meant, you've got to pick a side. You can't just pretend you stay out of this. And every reporter, we're trained to do this. We pretend we stay out of the fray. And he's saying, you can't do that. And if you're going to say what's happened to me is wrong, then you have to be prepared to publicly stand up and say it's wrong and defend Zak as a person. And I'd not been committed to do that. I'd been holding back from committing myself to it. And I got that message and I didn't really know what to do with it. And then soon after that, I actually left the paper I was working on and we moved back to the UK for a bit. And things kind of went south for me personally. I had a big fight with depression, which lasted quite a long time. And I was out of work and living somewhere. I didn't have any friends. We'd moved to a new part of the country and it was obviously dark and cold and wet. And
on top of all of that, your daughter.
Yeah, and then my daughter got sick. My daughter has cancer. So I was just kind of coming out of that fight with depression, and we got the news that my daughter was very ill, and it completely out of the blue. And I started writing to Zak because I didn't really have anyone to talk to. But more than that, I didn't want to talk to the people I was physically with, because blokes aren't very good at this. And if I was talking to the people I was physically with, I could see their reaction. And I wasn't quite sure how they respond, particularly when you're talking about personal things. And as a bloke, particularly when you're exhibiting weakness.
Are you finding this difficult right now, talking about it?
No, yes and no. There's a silver lining to talking about depression and to talking about you want a family member going through something like cancer treatment, which so many of us are going to go through some of these things at some point. And the silver lining is that if you can talk about it, it might help somebody else. And so I kind of see it that it's not fun to talk about it, but it might be useful for someone to talk about it. And that maybe that's an extension of me being a reporter. Most people in this room, I'm really sad to say, are going to experience either themselves or a loved one hitting depression or hitting a cancer treatment at some point. And if in any way it has helped for somebody to stand up and say, this is what I went through, you're not alone, and this helped, then that's my silver lining. So with Zak, like, I didn't want to talk to my new friends because I didn't know how they'd respond. But I got Zak, and I got this kind of relationship. And he started writing to me because his first letter was basically, mate, I'm really sorry I told you to grow some balls. I was angry at the time. I shouldn't have said it. And, thanks for everything you did. But he put his address on the top of the letter. And so I wrote back. And the thing about writing to Zak was he was so far away. He was on the other side of the world. He was in prison. He wasn't getting out anytime soon. And I couldn't see his reaction. And so I'd write these letters about, being down and being black or struggling to find work and the pressure of having to, I'd got kids and had to support them. And then when Poppy got sick. And so the letters evolved through all of that, and then he started writing back, and he started giving me advice, and I took it. I actually quit a job in large part because of something Zak said to me. So in the middle of all of that, I was commuting to and from work 2 hours each way to a job I hated, but I thought I need to pay the bills. And Zak wrote to me this one letter. I won't forget it. He added up all the hours I spent on the train over a week, a month, a year. And then he said, that is the time you're not spending with your family. And I was like, oh, yeah, he's right. And I quit the job. And I got so much happier as a result.
He probably doesn't have the education that most people here have been fortunate to have, or that comfortable lifestyle. But he actually sees through, and there are many episodes in the book where he actually sees through right to that crystal moment of an issue, doesn't he? He understands how life works probably better than most people.
Yeah, he's seen much more of life and much more of death. He's a convicted murderer, and he's never going to lose that. He's been branded with that, and he's been in prison with people who have done. He does a great impression of Bradley Murdoch. The guy did the Peter Falconio. He was locked up with Bradley Murdoch for years and years and years. He does I'm not going to do it now.
Come on.
No. But if you ever meet Zak, and maybe you will, he does a hilarious impression of Bradley Murdoch, who isn't a very nice man. But yeah, okay, so Zak can see through a lot of the stuff. Like, we build barriers in the way we talk to each other. And a big part of our letter writing as well is, at the start, I wasn't sure if Zak actually had committed this murder. I'd done all this reporting, and in my own head, I'd kind of dodged the question. The judge had said, I don't believe Zak was physically present when this murder happened. But the prosecution had argued he was. And there were 3 people convicted of that murder. One of them said Zak was there. One of them said Zak wasn't there. And Zak himself said he wasn't there. So the prosecution said he was. And the judge said, look, don't think he was. But in my head, I'd kind of dodged the question. And this was about defending him, about picking a side. I hadn't forced myself to confront whether or not I believed Zak was a killer. And so in these letters, I started to confront it. And then he asked me directly, how long do you think I should have got in jail? And I avoided the question for months. Our letters would take months to exchange. And in one letter, he just wrote, your answer started here. And then he drew this big spiral like this. And then at the end of it, he wrote, and ended here. And I was like, yeah, you saw straight through that.
So you've got all of this swirling on in your private life. You've got depression, your anguish over work. You've got 9-year-old Poppy with neuroblastoma, which is what, cancer of the nerve cells?
Cancer of the nerve cells, yeah.
So you're battling all of this. You're corresponding with Zak.
Yeah.
And then you sit down and start writing the book.
Yeah.
And you write 40,000 words. And let me tell you, 40,000 words is hard going. And you throw it all out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why?
Oh, it's worse than that. I almost wrote 80,000 words and threw that all out. And then I wrote another 40 and then threw that out as well. Because I wrote the book for the wrong reasons. I've said this to the publisher since. When Poppy got diagnosed, I knew I was going to need flexible work that I could do from home. Because, we were going into 3 years of really intense treatment. That was the best case we were given at that point. We were told in the first meeting with the doctors, Poppy's got a less than 50% chance of surviving the next 5 years. And your best case is you've got 3 years of horrendous treatment. No one pulled any punches. It was going to be tough. So I knew that I was going to need to have flexible work I could do ideally from home. And so I pitched this book based on this case. And Zak and I had started writing letters at this point, and he'd convinced me to quit my job with the BBC just before Poppy got diagnosed. And I can't remember. With Poppy's treatment, I knew I was going to need to be able to support the family. And I went to the publisher and I pitched this book based on, largely on the fact that I'd done this video series and Zak and I had written a few letters at that point. And I pitched it without telling the publisher because I knew I needed the money. And the publisher commissioned the book, and then I had to try and write it. And so I was writing bits of it in the ward. You know, Poppy would be out and I'd be feet up on the bed. Don't ever try and write a book in a paediatric oncology ward because it's not very conducive to clear thinking. So I might do 300 words a day was a good day. And then I got up to mostly of a draft, and I read through it and I thought, it's rubbish. It's just awful. And I junked it, and then I started again and got about halfway, and then I junked that, but I kept bits of it.
Why was it awful?
Because I wasn't telling the truth. It
So
was awful.
True crime writer guilty of fraud.
Yeah. My intentions hadn't been honest going into it because I was doing it for money. And maybe that was well-intentioned. And this is the complicated thing about the truth, isn't it? Like, you think the truth's easy and you think the truth is black and white, but it's not really. My intentions weren't really noble in that I was doing it for money, even though I was doing it because we really needed the money. And so I did this version and I read through it and I was like, it's just not honest. I was expecting all this truth from Zak about whether or not he was a murderer and what it was like to be in his situation and the effect of growing up in Katherine and these mandatory sentences. I was expecting all this truth. And I read through that last draft and there was no truth in it from me at all. And then I came in, it was just before Christmas a couple of years ago, and I sat down with almost 80,000 words, and in 2 weeks I wrote through it from beginning to end and put all of the truth about myself in it. I put why I started reporting on Zak. I put the depression, I put the cancer treatment with Poppy, I put how my feelings about Zak had changed from suspecting that maybe he was guilty to 100% no, I do not think he was there. And it was only when I put that truth in, I could feel the book coming to life. And at the end of it, I can remember walking out and saying to my wife, I think that's the best thing I've ever done. But it took that experience, which was horrendous, of being honest with myself in the book. That was what made it work.
So the man who wasn't there
was me.
Was you,
Yeah.
as well as Zak.
Yeah, it was me. It was me. Yeah.
There you go.
It was me in more than one way. So Zak was the man who wasn't there because he wasn't there when the murder was committed. And it was me because I wasn't there in the book. But it was also me because for a large time I wasn't there for my family. Like, I had depression, and it's really, really awful disease, depression, because it shuts you off from the world around you. It makes it really hard to communicate with people and share with people. And so my wife was going through, we had young kids, we'd moved back to the UK, and I was pretty absent. And then Poppy got diagnosed, and I was pretty absent for a chunk of that as well. And then, I wasn't there for my family at the time when I was writing this book. I was disappearing into writing this book, which kind of allowed me to forget the world we were living in. And if it all sounds bleak and dark, it was for a while, but
Hadn't COVID just started as well?
Oh yeah, but for us, this is the funny thing, right? So COVID, I know it was a big deal for everyone else. For us, it was like a second or third tier medical issue because we were dealing with like Poppy. That was the thing we were concentrating on. It was only later that we kind of realised we'd seen all these nurses and these doctors for months. We'd seen some of them every day. We didn't know what any of them looked like, to the point where I was doing some exercise, some training, kettlebell training, where we lived, and there was this woman who was new to the group, and I was sure she was checking me out. And I was like, she keeps looking at me. And I was like, that's great. That doesn't happen very often. Because she kept looking at me and kind of being like that. I had no idea who she was. And I walked away, and then I realised that was the doctor that diagnosed Poppy. She was the surgeon who broke the news about Poppy's condition. So she obviously knew what I looked like because I wasn't wearing a mask. No idea.
Just slightly off the subject,
sorry.
Very briefly, but they are extraordinary places, aren't they, when you go to a hospital that look after children with cancer. I've had a couple of visits there reporting-wise.
Yeah.
And the people there are just incredible.
Yeah. Look, Garry understates what he did. We were talking about this morning. He didn't have a couple of visits. He spent 3 months in a paediatric oncology ward as a reporter, and that's what he won a Walkley Award for writing about. And the thing we talked about was, I know everything we've said so far in this conversation is quite dark. We're talking about cancer, we're talking about murder. What you realise when you go to a paediatric oncology ward and spend a lot of time there, and also what you realise when you become really engrossed in reporting on a family who's gone through the kind of things that Zak's family have, is they're not just stories of sadness, they're stories of defiant hope. Those families in those wards are fighting every day against the situation they're in to keep going and to keep supporting their children. And some of those stories are of beating that disease and of getting out. They're stories of love and generosity. And it was the same thing with Zak's family. They'd had their son taken away and put in prison for something he actually didn't do. And they fought the system, and they fought to have his story heard. And they continued to love him and try to support him. And they triumphed in all of those ways. And that's what I like about what I do. I do a lot of crime reporting. And crime reporting kind of gets shoved into a bit of a corner some ways and looked a bit down on because it's a bit dirty and a bit grisly and a bit sensationalist. And some of it is. But when it's done well, it's stories of hope and grief and love and hate and justice and injustice. It's all the biggest things in the human experience. And short of war reporting, which I've never done, I can't imagine anything in which you see people you see them at their most raw and also at their most brave doing this kind of work. And those are the stories you see in an oncology ward. Those are the stories you see when someone goes through these kinds of experiences. And those are the stories of hope and defiance and triumph in the face of adversity that ended up being what this book is about. But they obviously start from something pretty terrible.
This is a touchy subject for journalists and authors, but is Zak a subject or a friend?
I was thinking about this the other day. Zak's a friend. Zak now is a friend. And he was a subject, and then I got to know him personally through his letters primarily. And then he became a subject and a friend. Like, you don't take advice from someone who's just a subject. You don't quit your job because someone's just a subject. You take advice from your mates.
It's an unlikely friendship, isn't it?
It is. It's a
weird...
weird...
40-something Pom and a 20-something Aboriginal kid from Katherine.
Yeah.
And you've clicked.
Yeah. And you know what was strange? So Zak did get out fairly... In fact, bizarrely, Zak was released from prison the week the book was published, just before Christmas. And it's strange. Look, it just happened. And I went up...
Go on, take the credit for it.
I went up a couple of weeks after, and when the dust had settled for him, and met him and gave him a copy of the book. And the first time I'd met him, and we just sat and we had coffee and we talked, but we talked like old mates. You know, with old mates, you pick up conversations from months ago. You might not have seen them for that long. Or you pick up the phone and you just keep rolling that relationship. We just kept that relationship rolling. So he is a friend.
Has he read the book?
Yeah.
His thoughts?
He liked it, actually. He sent me a photo. All of the main people who are touched on in the book have read the book. The judge has read the book. Zak's read the book. Zak's parents have read the book. His brother and sister have read the book. The woman who, and it gets complicated, but the woman who paid for that murder to take place, she's read the book. And I've heard back from all of them, and their feedback, they most of them read it while it was being written, so their feedback was factored into the book. Zak read it after the event, and he sent me a photo of the title page with just a big smiley face drawn on it. And he sent me that, and I think he said something like, "I loved it." Those people's validation is probably the most important to me. Like, so when you're a reporter, and you'll know this, you've got a responsibility, and as a writer, you've got a responsibility to your readers or your audience. That's really important. Like, we try and get things right because we're responsible to you. But also, as I get older, I realise you've got a responsibility to the people you write about, not to do any harm, and that's really important. And so if Zak's family had got back in touch with me afterwards and said they were deeply upset and I'd caused them immense emotional pain by what I'd written, or worst of all, that it was wrong, I don't think I could have, I don't know how I would have dealt with that. But for them to come back and say, "Look, we're glad you did this. It's helped and it's right," that's what matters. Even though there's only maybe half a dozen of them.
But it's such a fine line, isn't it, between portraying the lives of these people and explaining the sort of bleak aspects of their lives as well as the hope that you talked about, and being condescending. It's a very fine line, isn't it, for a writer?
And there's another fine line, which is whose story is it? Like, who gets to tell the story? And it gets more complicated when you're dealing with a community like an Aboriginal community where stories are really important. And ownership of stories is really important, and how you tell stories is important, and it's culturally different to the way you deal with it. And so in this case, you've got. So when I report on something, I tend to do longer projects now. I used to be a sort of a daily news reporter. I tend to do longer stuff now that might take a few months, or in this case, a few years. My general rule is I would never write about a crime without the consent of the victim's family, because the last thing I ever want to do is cause them more emotional harm. In this case, that was really complicated because the victim's family of the original murder that Zak was convicted over weren't keen on the idea. They came round to it when we did the original reporting, but I think they were pretty furious with the way we dealt with it. And partly that's because the victim's family isn't an innocent. The victim in this case is a horrendous, horrendous person. And as bad as it sounds, I can understand why someone wanted to kill him. And I might have wanted to make the same decision myself. And, you know, if you want to know the full details, you can obviously read the book, but I have a lot of this sounds really bad. I have a lot of sympathy for the woman who was his fiancée who wanted him dead. And so, do I need to get his family's permission to write that story? And then is it Zak's story? And it wasn't until I was up, I've been to Darwin a few times, Katherine a few times, and it wasn't until I was up there towards the end of writing this book, and I was chatting to Zak's brother about the story, and he said something along the lines of, he was talking about, you know, the Aboriginal story about the rainbow serpent. And he was talking about that, and he was talking about the song lines, and he said, "Do you understand the idea of the song lines?" And I kind of gave him like, yeah, maybe as well as any white bloke who's read the song lines does. And he was like, he kind of explained them to me in his words, and then he said, "Look, this journey you're on," because the song lines are about following a journey across Australia, so this journey you're on now with this book is your story. It's not our story, it's your story to tell. And we support you in telling your story. And it wasn't until he said that I actually felt able to go away and do this properly.
You've got a great quote in the book. It says you get a lot of misfits in the Northern Territory who think that distance will solve their problems. I think it's Greg Kavanagh, the coroner up there. Yeah. You've spent a bit of time in the Northern Territory. Are there anyone here from the Northern Territory? Great, let's get into it then. Is there something in the water up there? I mean, there are more crazy people per square metre than anywhere else in the country.
Yeah, and it makes you crazy. It's hard being in the Northern Territory. It's hot and everything is going to kill you, and everything is sharp, and it's exhausting, and if you walk off the road, you'll probably be killed by a pig, and it's amazing. It's beautiful, and it's full of life, and it's full of adventure, and it drives people mad. And mad people go there because it is so far away from everything. It's one of the best places on earth, and I could not live there. I can do the Northern Territory for about 3 weeks at a time, and then I have to retreat south. I think it attracts people who don't settle anywhere else, and I think it always has done. At least since kind of colonization, it always has done. But I also think when you go there, it changes you. It's hard being in the Territory.
Let's get on to that touchy subject of crime as clickbait. Now, when I was editor of the Daily Telegraph, I quickly discovered that if I put a story about a shark attack on the front page, sales went up 5,000. And then if I did a front page story on John Ibrahim, the King of the Cross, sales would go up 10,000. And I used to fantasize all the time about a shark attacking John Ibrahim so that we'd have a huge sellout. Now, what we're seeing these days, though, is crime as clickbait. I mean, it runs on all the websites.
Yeah.
There's this incredible attraction, and maybe someone can ask, we're coming up to questions in a few moments, but the extraordinary attraction that true crime has, particularly among women. Now, I'll prove my point by just asking the men in the room to put their hands up. If you're a man, put your hand up. Thank you very much. I think we've got about 90% women here. And there's been various scientific studies and research conducted over it. No one's really come up with an answer. We'll get to that in a moment. But first, do you feel uncomfortable sometimes being a true crime reporter and
I feel
knowing
I have to
that
justify myself?
Your organisations will sometimes use it to drive more and more eyeballs to the website and therefore more and more advertising revenue?
Yeah, I feel I have to justify what I do a lot because look, true crime gets done really badly. I don't even like the title true crime. It's just, what I do is just reporting. True crime gets done as entertainment, and it gets sold and it gets packaged up. And one of the God, I sound old saying this. One of the worst things I think that ever happened to journalism was, look, going online's been great, and websites are great and all of that, but it means we can monitor what people are reading and we can get all these numbers about what people like in a way we could never do. Garry and I are both old enough to have worked in newspapers when you just put stories you thought were important on the front page. Now we build whole websites around what's going to get the most clicks. And the worst organisation I ever worked at for doing this was the BBC. Completely click-driven. But that means that, to be honest, the stories that we should all be writing to get the most clicks are either shark kills John Ibrahim or cat stuck up tree, because those stories go off like you wouldn't believe.
Or Kim Kardashian with another butt implant or something
like that.
You know?
Kim Kardashian with cat-shaped butt implant would break the internet.
This is what saddens journalists, because when the internet came in, suddenly we've got, in live time, we have screens, and overlaid on that web page are all the numbers running. And they run constantly. So you know that suddenly a story's gone from 80,000 eyeballs down to 20,000 in the last 5 minutes. Kill it or put a new headline on it. Yeah, and lift that up and lift up another story and replace it with that.
In the offices of Garry's old newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, those screens are up and every journalist can see them. There's only about 6 journalists left. But also the Sydney Morning Herald, they have junked this, but they used to have a system where each reporter was essentially audited on the number of clicks their stories got. And I can remember one of their reporters telling me, you know, this was a crime reporter, I used to try and do the big important policy stories, but I need to get my stories up, so I'm going to do some slash horror court case where someone's been beheaded with an axe just to get my clicks up. And so that has changed the way we report, and crime is now used to drive that audience. But that also changes the way we go about it, because we need a story today and we need one tomorrow and we probably need one for breakfast and lunch and dinner. I don't do that kind of reporting. Look, if you haven't been and spoken to a family, and really if you haven't been inside their house and spent time with them and then gone back and spent time with them again, then I don't think you can start to try and tell their story. So everything I do flies in the face of where a lot of journalism has been hauled. So sometimes it's quite precarious finding work, but I don't think we can just get pulled down that road, because you'll end up with crap stories being recycled constantly and the same stories coming up again and again and again and again, done badly.
It's a bit of a paradox, though, because this room here is full today. Netflix are releasing yet another true crime series today, tomorrow, the following day.
Yeah.
These things rate and they work.
And they work.
So aren't you giving the public what they want anyway?
Yeah. Look,
we can tut about it, but
look, but those true crime series on Netflix, they'll have taken probably a year to pull together. TV has the time and the money to do these things in a way that maybe papers don't anymore, or rarely do. There's some great work done in papers.
Why are we drawn to it, though?
Oh man,
why are we sort of fascinated by the macabre so much?
I've never been able to work this one out for myself. All right, so you guys will probably know this answer better. And I'd also be fascinated to know why it's women who like true crime so much. Because, I'm not one of... Yeah, go on.
Good point. They're often the victims.
That's probably the best answer I've ever heard. Just in case...
I'm getting some nasty looks here because we haven't got the microphone ready, so we will get onto that in a minute.
Just in case the voices didn't carry, the first answer to why women are interested is because they're often the victims, 100%. And second answer was an interest in the psychology of how these crimes can occur. That's kind of been my thinking. I think you're both right, but the thinking I've done is people are interested in true crime because it charts the realms of what's possible. By which I mean what's possible for any one of us to do. Like, everyone who becomes a criminal is just a person, and probably they had a childhood, they were a baby, they were a child, they grew up, and then something happened that has caused them to become a criminal. And the flip side of that is that any person can become a criminal. Like, I don't doubt that anyone in this room could do something awful if circumstances drove them to it. And I think that psychology is really interesting. And when you read true crime, you are almost trying to explore that kind of dark world that we try and ignore most of the time, but any of us can fall into it. So,
look, in the book...
Yeah? No, it's all right, no. Which is also a part... It's part of the we're often victims, but we're not the victims this time. Yeah. This is great. Go on, sorry.
I'm interested in solving who's committed the murder.
Okay.
And the way it's solved.
Sorry, can you repeat that, because we're podcasting it? Unless you talk into the microphone, we don't get it.
I'm interested in solving the murder, how it all revolves around it, and it sort of ends in the final chapter.
Yeah. So
that part interests me.
Yeah. So it's almost the storytelling, isn't it? So you start with this crime. How do you tell this or understand the story to take you to how that happened or who did it? All of these elements, I think, are part of it. The thing about women often being the victim, though, I think that's got to be a part of it. Like, you look at, there was a figure I saw recently, the proportion of homicides committed internationally, this is from the UN, I think 95% of homicides are committed by men. And I wouldn't be surprised if most of the victims are women. Yeah.
That's right.
They're all busy, is that what you're saying?
Talking about murder and mayhem, you killed those first 40 or 50,000 words of the book.
I killed them, yeah.
And then completely restructured.
Yeah.
How did you go about the writing process? Because to me, and I know a lot of people here are fascinated by it as well, it's like walking. How do you put one foot in front of the other? When you start thinking about it, you fall over. So sometimes it's just a natural instinct that kicks in.
Yeah.
Did you find it easy once you got into a rhythm of writing? Were there ways did you play music in the background? What did you do?
Key thing is not to think about it. And I've learnt this over time by writing different books. Do not think about what you're doing and accept that your first draft is going to be god-awful. But it's really important that you do that first draft because the magic happens in the redraft. And you probably have a completely different experience, but first book I wrote, I redrafted every chapter as I went. I wanted it to be perfect before moving on. And I just spent weeks and weeks just chewing through nonsense with no sense of how the story fitted together, because it is all about the story. But now I will just sit down and I will just tell myself, today you're going to do 2,000 words, or you're going to finish this chapter, and then tomorrow you will move on. And when you've got a complete draft, only then will you go back and look at it. Because if you get caught up in trying to make it perfect, it won't be. You need to get the whole thing out without thinking and then go back, and then you can start to make it into a book.
I mean, this book is different to your other books.
Yeah.
I mean, it's more written.
Yep.
You were more of a reporter in those other books. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah.
And you've taken on more of a writing kind of role, I think. Because there are many passages, I haven't marked them, but they're quite moving and poignant.
Yeah, the publisher, when I started, I did this book with a company called Ultimo. It's a small publishing house. And as a result, they're really involved. They're bloody good, actually. And when they commissioned this book...
That's a headline, author praises publisher.
This is also...
I hope mine's not here.
So I've written 5 books over the years. This is the first... I probably shouldn't say this publicly. This is the first time one of the covers... I've really liked the cover of one of my books. And I really love this one. But Ultimo just put their heart and soul into every aspect of making this book. So, look, when I started this book, the publisher, one of the 2 publishers commissioned it, he said to me, he kind of took me aside and he said, look, you're not bad at what you do. I'm paraphrasing. He said, you're not bad at what you do, but I don't think you've ever really pushed yourself to be a writer. You haven't tried as hard as you can. And I was like, no, I haven't, because I'd been afraid to. Because if you try really hard and fail, it's worse, so it's easier not to try. You should read all my other books, by the way. But this one's better. But what he was basically saying was you haven't backed yourself to try as hard as you can to be as good as you can. And in this book, I did. So it's the first time I really thought I'm going to try and write this one.
We've got just a couple more minutes before we'll go to questions. I wanted to ask you about Zak.
Yeah.
What happens to Zak now? How long? He was in prison for
14 years.
14 years.
Yeah.
He's now, how old? 30?
He said he was 32,
32,
I think. Yeah.
What does someone like that do with the rest of their life?
You know, it's funny, Zak asked me that. Towards the end of writing this book, I went to see him in prison a couple of times and sat down with him. And he said to me, how does this book end? Because at that point, I hadn't finished it. And so I was trying to keep him in the loop about what I was doing and how I was going about it. And I sent him pages from the book in different letters. And he said, how does this end? And I said, the last chapter is the hardest one, Zak, because that's the one you've got to write yourself. And that's absolutely true. He's come out of prison as a young man with 14 years in which he's basically been allowed to do nothing. And it's almost enforced boredom up there. And not really any rehabilitation, very little in the way of education while he's been in prison. And he's branded a convicted murderer. Can you imagine how hard it is to get a job when that's what you have to tell your employer? And Zak actually started work this week. He got a job and he's had his first week at work. But he has sent out, he told me last weekend, about 50 CVs or gone to dozens of interviews. Some of them have gone well until they've said, do you have a criminal history? And he's like, yes, for murder.
What's he doing? What's his job?
He's working in a... it's not carpentry, it's a wood production. So they make kind of cupboards and kind of furniture like that. And it's 12-hour shifts. He's gone well for his first week because he's got a 2-hour commute now to and from work. Actually, I talked to him about that. And look, he said to me, we exchanged messages a couple of days ago. He said, look, this isn't the forever job. And I said, no, it's not, but it's your first step. So to come out of prison, to have all of that in your past, to feel that you were done wrong by the state, to have to try and find a home, to find work, to find friends, to rebuild friendships, if you even want to go back to those old friends. Because not all of them stayed by him in prison. He's got to build a life from basically the hardest start I can imagine. So the end of the book, the last chapter, is that one he's trying to write right now.
Given the advice he gave you and you quit your job on the basis of it, you could always become a career counsellor at some stage anyway. Okay, it's 12:20. I've been given the wind-up, so it's time for about 10 minutes of questions. So if you'd like to raise your hand, and we'll bring the mic around to all of you so that you can be heard.
Thank you. That was an amazing session, and I have read the book and enjoyed it very much.
Oh, thank you.
And your length of time that you stayed involved with Zak is amazing over a number of years. It became a lot more than just a book. What I wanted to say was, and this isn't a flippant question, it sounds like winning a Walkley Award becomes an addiction, a bit like having a Michelin 3 stars. Yeah. How do you live on with that?
I think it goes... You know what? It gets easier as you get older. I think when you're younger and you do need that validation, or maybe you're less confident and you need that validation. I can remember needing people to give me awards because it meant I was doing well. And then you get older and life kicks you around a bit, which everybody's life does, and it becomes much less important. So I now manage a small team. We make podcasts, and I've got a producer who's phenomenally talented, but very young, and she really, really wants to win awards. And I get it, but they're not important. They don't count for anything except, and this is the really good thing about winning awards, is it means you can go to your boss next time and say, I want to do this project, and they'll go, well, that last one won awards, so you can definitely do what you want to next time. It gets easier to deal with that addiction. No, I don't care anymore.
They're good for pay rises, though, aren't they?
Yeah, next. There's two good things about them. Look, we all want people to tell us we've done a good job. The media are very good at self-congratulation, in case you hadn't noticed. We have a lot of awards. None of them really matter. It's knowing you've done the right thing by people and having people like Zak's family say you've done the right thing by us. That's the thing that, when I look back at the end of my life, that I'll be pleased with.
But having said that, we do love the Walkleys more than the Logie Awards, don't we?
I've never won a Logie,
more.
so I wouldn't know.
Much more. Okay, we've got another question up here.
Yeah, Dan, I just wanted to ask you about the word murder.
Yeah.
I mean, you've used the word a lot today, and you use it in the book. When I read the book, I didn't really think it was a murder. Calling it a good deed probably takes it a bit far. But you know, I'm sure the boys who did it, who struggled to do it, didn't think they were doing a murder. And I'm just wondering if you thought about using a different word.
Yeah, okay, so that's interesting. And it goes to the nature of this murder, so, this killing. So Ray, the victim, was killed as a result of his fiancée, who'd been abused for a very long time by him, basically she just wanted it to stop. And so she paid some people to carry it out. And there's a dispute as to whether or not they thought they were just going to go and bash him and it got out of hand, or whether they actually knew they were going to kill him. I think they knew they were going to try and kill him, because they prepared for it. But what it comes down to at the end of the day is what the law says it is, because that's what they were convicted of. And the law in the territory, you've got mandatory sentencing, which is a bit weird, but the law around murder in the territory is also weird. So in the territory, if you agree to take part in a murder, even if you back out, which is what Zak's did, unless you stop that murder from happening, then you're guilty of the murder. So in Zak's case, the law said, because you agreed to take part and you didn't, after backing out, pick up the phone, dial the cops and say, my mates are off to commit a murder, can you stop them? Therefore, he was guilty of murder, as if he'd been the person who dealt the fatal blows. So the jury basically had no choice. They had to call it a murder, which they did. And then the judge had no choice, because the same politicians that write the law say, if you're guilty of murder, you have to send them to jail for life. So it was found to be a murder by a system in the NT that even the people who work there don't think the justice system's great, to be honest. So I've called it a murder for that reason. I think it was premeditated, and the law found it to be a murder. The question is the law working?
All right, was our roving Mike up the...
Yes, I've got
Okay.
a question. A question is really about systems and how systems drive behaviour. So you've talked about clickbait, you've talked about Walkleys. What is easy to measure is not necessarily what is right to measure.
Yeah.
And I'd be interested to hear you comment on that.
I'll take on that first one because, look, it's a tough one. Journalists, back in the early 80s when I first started in journalism, we sat around a room and we pontificated and we scratched our chins and stared at our navels, and then we decided what we thought was important that readers should know.
They were good days.
Yeah, they're great. We were the kings of facts. We had the facts. We decided how we would disseminate those facts to everyone, what importance we would give them, page 1, page 3, way at the back. And then this new technology has arrived and it tells us something completely different. What we thought were worthy and important are not necessarily that. And I think that's the great battle that's going on at the moment. What is important? What is worthy? Now, I think we'll all agree that Gaza is important and Ukraine is important and all of those big world-defining events, they're important. But Kim Kardashian drives enormous amount... I know you're shaking your head, but that's the reality. So that's that old snobbishness of journalism that we know what's right and what you should be reading has been lost. It's a little bit the emperor's clothes have been sort of dragged away and exposed what people really want to read about. Now, back in the day when I was putting the bulletin out, we were selling 60,000 copies of the oldest magazine in the country, and it did current affairs and news, and it was a bit of a rascal when it came to putting the middle finger up at the establishment. New Idea and Woman's Day was selling 600,000 copies. And everyone sneered at them. But they were the biggest selling magazines in the country. And they were basically being published using gossip and hearsay, and that they were the old clickbait. So, look, a lot has changed, but I still think that battle is going on now where the reader basically decides. Journalists no longer decide what is important. Yes, we can drive those clicks by using little marketing techniques, the way that Temu and some of those shopping websites now drive you because they've always got a spinning wheel saying, and I've been sucked in a couple of times, free $25 if you click on now. It's the whole thing, and we're being driven by this machine and no one's really in control of it anymore.
Well, I think there are two issues that I guess concern me about that. And that is that artificial intelligence is just repeating stuff to people that already read that stuff. So it just gets magnified and magnified. And then the second is, I guess, and you touched on it earlier about journalists being sacked and fact-checking being sacked. So, and I guess there's the role of distraction as well. So, I mean, you know, who doesn't want to be distracted from a life that is not pleasant? And we heard about that in terms of Zak.
Well, we were both sitting out there before we came on this panel talking about how we've seen. We were lucky enough to live through the golden days, and they were truly golden days of the media. And, you know, I worry about what my kids and my grandkids will be reading because the way the phenomenal speed of AI now, there are newsrooms now being decimated across America, emptied, because the computer's coming in to replace them.
But just on this, see, everything both of you have said I agree with, but I think that's what's really important is there are those of us who do have to fight really hard to do, okay, this is going to make me sound a bit highfalutin, but you have to fight really hard to do the journalism that's important because it is important, okay? And that's our job. And if the tide is going the other way, then we just have to swim as hard as we can against it. But here's the kicker. To make that work, you have to make people want to read it. No one's going to read an article I write if it's really important, if it's boring. So the articles I write, if I want to get people to read stuff that I think is important, have to be really interesting. And that's where you get into another tricky area, which is I have to do non-fiction using some of the tricks of fiction and of entertainment. I have to do, I choose to do cliffhangers. I choose to make it feel like a good story because I want you to keep reading my stuff because I think it's important that you know this stuff, but you're not going to do it just because I think it's important. I have to make you want to read the story. And that's the only way I can think of swimming against the tide.
And that much hasn't changed because Truman Capote was doing it
100%.
70 years ago in cold blood.
100%.
Nothing's changed there at all.
Yeah.
So stick with the written word.
Or podcasts.
I think we're just about done. I'm sorry. We've got time for one more? Or
One more question. Is there one more?
just over here. Oh, hang on. We've got two to go. Quickly, two.
I haven't read your book, and I don't know whether this is about Indigenous people killing an Indigenous person, and if that's the case, did law come into it? LORE law?
No, the victim was white, and two of the other co-conspirators were white as well.
Right.
Law comes into it in as much as, and this is a conversation I had with Zak's mum quite a lot, who comes from a family of lawmen in sort of one of the tribes she comes from. To understand it and to have some kind of sense of ownership of the story, you have to understand a lot of that. And Glenys was good about teaching me a lot. And then we had a tussle over whose story it was to tell, because she wanted control of it. And I said, I can't give you control of it. I didn't come here to tell the story you want. I came here to try and tell the story as best I can. I've written other books. I did a book about that triple murder called Boweryville, where law came into it a lot more, because in that case you had an unsolved murder of 3 children, which the white justice system, for want of a better word, had failed to deal with, and has still failed to deal with, in that nobody has gone to jail. And the Aboriginal people that those kids came from talked to me a lot about law, and about how one of the fundamental precepts of law was that if you commit a crime, justice is delivered very quickly, and if you hurt someone, you will be hurt in return. And they had seen these white people come in with their own system of law that, as far as they can see, just didn't deliver justice. And that was one of the great tragedies of that. It does come into it, definitely.
And just a second part of that question, is part of the rationale of your ethic, your journalistic writing ethic, especially in relation to this mandatory sentencing that you speak about in the Northern Territory, to actually attempt to change that system?
Yeah. If I'm being really honest.
He's also going to take out a Tesla ticket tonight, aren't you?
Look, one thing I've learnt when I start these projects, and I was saying this just last week, I don't promise people anything. If I do some reporting, nothing might change, or stuff might get worse. But in this case, they have changed some of the mandatory sentencing laws up there. Not completely, and they haven't changed mandatory sentencing for murder, but they used to have a lot of mandatory sentencing for other offences, drug offences, minor violence offences, and a lot of those have been changed over the past few years, and partly as a result of our reporting, and partly as a result of the campaigning Zak's mum, Glenys, did. And it's all credit to her that as a result, some of these laws have been changed, and a lot of people's lives will be different because of that.
On that note, let's have a very big thank you.